Our students are suffering. We need this project.
I almost look at it like a land grab, that they're moving across 101 into the middle of residential neighborhoods.
It would be the largest housing project in Arcata history. 5 buildings hosting 602 students here at Craftsman's Mall. The Arcada Plaza is located south of the area that appears in this image. HSU's northern border is at the bottom right. Starting at the intersection with Sunset, follow the dotted red line north on LK Wood. Take the first left onto the St. Louis overpass, then another left on St. Louis Road, which dead ends at the proposed site. That's where 2 warehouses, some mobile homes, and other structures would be removed if the City Council allows Monterey-based Colerain Capital and their partner AmCal to buy the property from Nancy Kirkpatrick and build off-campus dorms.
When the students are living with fellow students and close to campus, again, all the metrics are better, so they typically are going to graduate. They're going to graduate sooner. They're going to graduate with higher GPAs. We have what we call an internet cafe, which is just a social gathering area where typically students, you'll see them gathering in the mornings or the evenings after class. We have study spaces, large and small study rooms. We have computer labs. We have presentation rooms.
Just 23% of HSU students live in on-campus dorms that offer student services. The remainder jockey for off-campus housing in what an outside expert described as a student-adverse environment. At least once during the past year, nearly 1 in 5 students did not have a permanent, regular place to stay.
The history on that dates back to around the late 70s, early 80s, and in through the 90s, when the housing stock here was cheap enough that parents sending their students to HSU were able to purchase units and have their students live in those units, and it was cheaper than trying to do an apartment or have a dorm room. And then those parents ultimately kept the properties as investment properties. The majority of homeowners in Arcata are legacy owners. It's really difficult for new owners to get into the market, and most of the market is bound up in rental housing. A lot of that rental housing goes to students. The city's boundaries are fairly fixed. We are not going to be spreading out into the bottomlands, taking up prime agricultural soils to put single-family residential parcels on and sprawl like LA would.
Some LA and Southern California natives struggle to find housing when they move to Arcata to attend Humboldt State.
I've spoken with them. They've said that they feel that they have been discriminated against by some landlords. We're proud of the fact that our projects are very diverse. So not just our residents, but also a large percentage of the employees at each of our communities, including our full-time staff and part-time resident assistants, our students of color.
Students of all ethnicities would qualify for the mostly 3- and 4-bedroom apartments. The rooms could be available by 2020 at the earliest. Rent will be tied to HSU dorm prices. If the village was hypothetically renting this fall, students would pay roughly $900 a month for their own room during the academic year.
You will not be allowed to have recreational drugs there. And so what we know is that students who would like to go out and party, which seems like a reasonable and natural thing, are going to need to go somewhere else. The easiest place to go is into the adjacent neighborhoods like ours, where there are already student rentals, already lots of parties, but putting 700 students in a place where they can't really have a party, but adjacent to places that have parties, is really a recipe for disaster.
In response to Eric Jules and more than 500 neighbors and village critics who form Arcata Citizens for Responsible Housing, or ACRH, AmCal and Colerain set the buildings 300 feet back from the western property line and adjacent Westwood neighborhood, lowered the buildings from 4 stories to 3 and 2 stories, reduced the number of students from 800 to 602, switched from a modern to farmhouse design that better suits Arcata, reduced some building amenities to lower rents, and increased on-site parking to 409 spaces to prevent spillover onto side streets. But some of the village's negative impacts are unavoidable.
It's currently a dangerous intersection at the intersection of LK Wood and Sunset. And all those students trying to come over that intersection, and a number of them coming across St. Louis also to LK Wood. And it will be 10 years at least before they can put in a roundabout. I'm concerned that when the city okays this project knowing there are unmitigatable traffic issues, that the first time somebody gets killed, a student gets killed, that the city's going to get sued.
Until that roundabout is built, the influx of students will cause traffic delays at the LK Wood Sunset intersection during morning and evening commutes. To approve the 11-acre project, the City Council must adopt a statement of overriding considerations declaring that the project's benefits outweigh that drawback. The Council must also rezone the Craftsman's Mall from industrial limited to medium-density residential and approve a planned development permit allowing the 45-foot three-story buildings to exceed City Code's 35-foot limit. The buildings will be roughly as large as the campus Creekview dorms.
Privatized dorms across the country have caused rents to go up in towns just like Arcata. What happens is that these dorms are built, they're high-end dorms, and they're built for students with money. Once those dorms are built, landlords in the adjacent neighborhoods realize they can charge more for their places, and it causes a ripple effect, increasing rents across whole towns, making them largely unaffordable for people without a lot of money.
My response to that is that that's absurd, that student housing is no different than any other component of the economy. The more supply you provide, the more pressure there is to keep prices down. By providing, more housing in the market, it's going to keep the pressure on, other landlords to keep their prices down to compete.
That competition for rent revenue is now spilling across the 101. This simulation shows a view of the village from the northbound Sunset on-ramp. Here's a second view from further north.
They should have worked with HSU to make this happen. HSU has space. They could have built it on HSU. I don't understand why they did not.
In December 2017, HSU's president said the university supported the village in concept. But in March, an HSU official denied any university involvement in the project. Then in late May, working off an ACRH-initiated Public Records Act request, the Mad River Union published emails revealing months of coordination between the developer and university officials. 11 days later, 4 of those officials appeared alongside the developer at City Hall.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the June 6, 2018 Arcata City Council meeting.
I'm pleased to share with you that Humboldt State University is actively working to finalize a partnership with AmCal in which HSU will manage the Village Student Housing Project. Without expanded housing opportunities, we would have serious concerns about HSU's ability to effectively serve the number of students that we currently enroll. The area does not have sufficient housing to support our current students. If HSU, for instance, would lose about 10% of our current enrollment, a reduction of about 800 students, this could have a negative impact to the regional economy of up to $19 million or more. Under the proposed management agreement, HSU would have full authority to operate the facility while ownership would be maintained by AmCal. The university would provide support and programming for students just as in on-campus housing. HSU does not have the ability or interest at this time to purchase the facility.
HSU administrator said last night that HSU was not interested at this time in acquiring the project. But we've all seen the emails published last week, so their believability on this issue is severely lacking. And anyway, at this time could end up being very short-lived. We know from those emails that HSU is very interested in seeing how many more students they can cram into those buildings by turning singles into doubles and so on. I simply don't trust HSU or AmCal to not pull a gigantic bait and switch and get this project approved under the premise of 600 students and then turn around and jack that number up by a few hundred. Please don't make me and my neighbors the sacrificial lambs of this project. We've lived in our homes in those neighborhoods for decades. If you feel you must approve this project, at least get a legally binding and enforceable commitment from AmCal and from HSU that the number of residents will never exceed 602.
602 would be included in the project description, the conditions of approval, the development agreement. If they wanted to change that, they would have to come back for an amendment to that plan development agreement. And I will provide the caveat that if HSU purchased the property, they would no longer be subject to our regulations.
That's because as a state university, HSU is not subject to city zoning restrictions. ACRH members worry the university could buy the village and increase the number of students, causing social havoc and parking spillover in the adjacent Westwood neighborhood. In a January email, a university official asked the developer about increasing the number of beds at the village.
To put the comment in context that's being lifted out of the emails as to how many of the rooms could be doubled up, that wasn't an effort to try and game the system and have a certain number of beds approved through our process and then have HSU take the project on and then be able to all of a sudden double up the beds. They were trying to evaluate at that point, could the project pencil out? What of the metrics that they're using in their pro forma could be adjusted so that it made sense to them?
David Moon says the university asked AmCal and Colerain about doubling up beds in order to lower rents.
I was aware of their conversations every time that AmCal came up, to my knowledge, to come to a public hearing before the Planning Commission. They also met with HSU during that same week. I want the council to understand that the knowledge that HSU and AmCal were discussing was not made public when the records request was made. The knowledge that they were discussing was made public when we were in early Planning Commission conversations because the issue was coming up. Why isn't HSU involved? And my response to that was, they are involved.
I just want to point out that in the emails, there's people specifically telling other people, we have absolutely nothing to do with this. And to me, that's different than we're talking with them, we're negotiating. And I mean, I've just witnessed over the couple years them, changing their tune on it. So I don't really think it's completely accurate to say that, this is all in good faith. The first thing that I come to is I don't feel good about our ability to control the project in the long term if it's purpose-built student housing. HSU is saying right now they have no interest in buying it, but it's like with this public records request, they've kind of made a bad track record for themselves with what they say and what they're actually doing or plan to do. So, I worry about doing something that is students only, HSU buys it, we've told the community it's going to be X, and HSU, they just make it Y because they can. A question I have is it possible to make a legally binding agreement with them that they will not increase the units?
We could put restrictions on the land title itself. They haven't been developed, they haven't been discussed with the developers. Well, the title sold by the private entity would go with the restrictions, and the restrictions can't be extinguished by transfer. But I'm not ready to sit here today and say it can be XYZ. I'm just saying that is a mechanism for restricting use of properties.
In addition to losing control over the number of students, the city could also lose property tax revenue if HSU bought the village.
There's an example that's been shared with us that has a potential for having a three-way agreement between HSU, AmCal, and the city that will provide for those ongoing tax base. I don't have a whole lot of detail at this point because that change has happened so recently. We haven't had a chance to get into discussions.
To compensate for some of the city's revenue loss, the draft development agreement requires at minimum a one-time $300,000 payment to the city if the developer sells the village to a tax-exempt entity like HSU. As the city, developer, and university work out agreements regulating tax payments, some project proponents are demanding action.
We need housing and we need it now. Well, I was struggling for housing 2 years ago and I became homeless. I was couch surfing, which many HSU students do. And I did my whole senior project on just trying to know how can we fix this problem. And how we can fix this problem is by having an actual housing project. Every time a student becomes homeless, they lose their dignity. That's something that happened to me. And so I just want to end with that I support this project.
Are we a progressive community or are we not? Are we going to just not have any kind of future development in Arcata? It's going to take a lot of money, and we don't actually have developers in our community that can do that. They don't have the deep pockets. That's why we're so fortunate to have someone come from out of town and want to step up to the plate to help us with a need that we actually have in our community. And we have other housing needs, but this is a site for our students.
We're talking about how there's more people of color up at HSU. Now people are having a hard time getting places. I'm a little concerned. Are we creating housing for people of color? And then what do we have? And then we have, separated neighborhoods. That creates more strife. And we're already suffering right now in this city from racial strife. This is an infill project that's 11 acres. It's probably one of our biggest infill projects we have. And for us to take this and turn it only into student housing, I think is very short-sighted, because in our presentation yesterday, we had 8,500 students up at HSU listed up there. Well, that was 2015. Right now, we're at about 7,700. We just built 142 apartments there. While we need student housing, we need every kind of housing in this community. We need professor housing. We need millennial professionals housing. We need housing for young families. Particularly, I completely cannot accept the unavoidable impact of traffic. And we just go, unavoidable? Oh well, move on. And it's like, I don't think that the overriding considerations are actually good enough, because I don't think there are socially overriding considerations. I think we're kind of creating a student-dense population that will not integrate into or experience the communities. I can't find the findings to say that it fits into the neighborhood. It does not fit into the neighborhood.
Ornelis's vision for redeveloping the Craftsman's Mall resembles ACRH's proposal. Although the City Council is not deliberating on that formulation, ACRH proposes housing ranging from single-family homes to three-story apartment complexes featuring 92 units and 276 bedrooms.
My concern is that we actually meet some infill requirements. I wouldn't look at any other kind of mixed development unless it had 600 beds in it. Okay. I don't think it's fair to say we're going to infill and then have 200 beds on a parcel that we've gone from 800 to 600 on. I don't see the meeting the infill requirement.
Meeting infill demand community-wide in Arcata requires building roughly 2,500 units, according to Community Development Director David Loya. He argues that attracting students to the village will help depress student housing demand and decrease the profitability of renting out homes. When the legacy homeowners sell, families who want to buy and live in those homes will no longer be crowded out of the market by investors.
By way of example, when the Janes Creek Meadows subdivision was built out, it was designed as and intended to be a family housing project that would have second units that would be able to be leased out to students. And what we find instead in Janes Creek Meadows is something like 80% of the homes are owned by investors. And so they lease out both the primary and secondary unit primarily to students. The market in Arcata is such that it's more cost effective to build that for investment, a residential rental property, than it is to move into it as a owner-occupied property. So we're way behind the eight ball on providing enough unit development to satiate the market demand, and we recognize that in our housing element. And so the policy really identifies that by building additional housing that's attractive to students, that will start to shift that dynamic, that eventually we'll be able to change that owner occupancy rate and start to get more owners into those single family units.
And then the story poles will walk back this way, but for the three-story buildings, we're roughly where we were standing. So we'll look at those.
On June 19th, City Council members and locals toured Craftsman's Mall. They walked the train tracks where ideally the developer would build a portion of trail leading to campus. Students would walk down EYE Street until that path is built.
No, we're not proposing sidewalks on this sidewalk. Can it happen? Certainly. The right-of-way exists.
Project proponents argue the village would reduce car commuting by relocating students from surrounding towns and housing them walking distance from campus.
Then there's a pipe that goes further, I believe 5 lots down.
Council members toured Maple Lane to the west, where a trail from the project would connect students to the Westwood neighborhood and Murphy's, and where some critics say even the village's reduced-size buildings would block views of the hillsides to the east. Critics say student housing belongs at the Trinity Annex site on the southern edge of campus, but HSU proposes a parking lot, bike repair station, and green space at that site.
Patrick, he said that he tried to get up there this afternoon.
Councilmember Michael Winkler did not join the walking tour. He will not vote on the village because of a potential conflict of interest. That means just 2 council no votes would doom the project. In response to questions posed by other council members during the June city council meetings, on July 3rd, the university released a summary of its draft management agreement with the developer. For 10 years, HSU can buy the village anytime it wants. If it exercises that purchase option, the university commits to both a payment in lieu of taxes and to honor the 602-bed limit. It's unclear whether the city will insist that it be a party to that contract or whether those terms will placate village skeptics. But as soon as a July 17th meeting, and likely at some point this summer, Brett Watson and Sophia Pereira will vote on whether to line up behind Susan Ornelas and turn their backs on the village, or whether to join Paul Patino and follow the advice of 2 former mayors by enlisting a Central California developer to help solve Arcada's housing crisis. Eric Black. Eric Black Video, Arcada.